Greetings, everyone. Once again, I'm glad to see you on this Friday afternoon in Europe and noontime in the United States. Welcome to a Voice of Christians podcast, a podcast which I emphasize just about every week is a podcast for relevant and intelligent conversations. In today's podcast, I am joined by sociologist Mark Regnerus from the University of Texas in Austin. Professor Regnerus, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you, Peter. Good to see you in person, and good to have a lengthier conversation this time.
Well, I thank you very much. I know that this is going to be the second time, God willing, that we'll be talking about a very important topic. I think that we spoke about 3-4 years ago for the first time. You honored us with your presence on my Facebook page. And the public in Romania has asked me several times about you, when you're going to get to Romania and speak and present us some of your findings, but we'll get into some of those topics today.
Sure.
Folks, in this topic, in this podcast tonight, we will talk about a relatively new but persistent aspect of the sexual revolution, what appears to be a surge in LGBT self-identification. It is a surge which is not necessarily based on this people who self-identify as members of the LGBTQ community, but based on something else. We'll also talk about what appears to be a decline in the transgender identity. It's something which I have learned from a recent post by Professor Regnerus, which sort of took me by surprise. And we'll talk about this very important and interesting topic because surprising as this topic might be to some of us, it does appear, based on statistical data, that the number of people who identify as transgender is declining, and we'll find from Dr. Regnerus why that seems to be the case. Finally, we will be talking about a very important topic which is very relevant for Romania right now this fall, and that is civil unions and partnerships, because as some of you know, there are rumors spreading or inside the Romanian parliament that attempts are underway right now to legislate civil partnerships in Romania. As you know, in Romania, civil partnerships are still against the law formally. We'll talk about that closely later on in the podcast, and we'll talk about the perils and the social impact of legislating civil partnerships on the natural family and society as a whole. I also want to emphasize that our guest tonight is eminently qualified to discuss issues of family and sexuality, as well as the impact of same-sex parenting on children. Professor Regnerus has written extensively on these topics and is a world-renowned expert on these topics. I am an avid reader of everything he publishes, particularly in the publication online Public Discourse, and I have read 2 of his books. Once again, Professor Regnerus, we are welcoming you to this podcast, and we are very honored to have you. And so let's start with the first topic on which you have written about 2 or 3 years ago, which came to mind about a month ago when I thought about doing this podcast with you, and that is the surge in LGBTQ self-identity. And before we actually focus on the LGBT part of the topic, I would like for you to explain to us what is self-identity for people like me that are no sociologists, normal, regular, everyday people. Of course, we know what identity means. We fill out applications, so on and so forth, government papers, and we know what our ethnic identity is, our racial identity, our national origin identity. It's things that we develop at birth, gender, male, female, but we are living in an age when self-identities pop up overnight. We are sort of confused, and we would like for you to give us an explanation as to what is self-identity in the context in obviously sociology, but in this day and age in which we live.
Yeah. Just to start with I'm not sure there's a strong distinction between identity and self-identity, except that kind of the language of the self has become to dominate public conversation in the last 40 years, I'd probably say. So there's no strong difference between identity and self-identity. It's what people are kind of thinking of as fundamental and essential to who they are as human beings, human persons. So when we think about some of the oldest identities, kinship is probably the most primal and oldest. We talk about blood is thicker than water. Kinship mattered a great deal. You go back to the Old Testament and you hear and you read stories about, I think it was Abraham and all the people that were in his household, right? Hundreds of people. That is testament to the fact that to survive in the ancient days, you had to sort of have not a nuclear family around you. That was kind of a foreign concept, but you had to be embedded in a larger familial situation, which in turn was embedded probably in a larger tribal situation, right? So these are identities that are fundamental to who people are. And I think we still sense them, right? Instead of tribal identities, we'll sometimes replace those with national identities. But certainly family remains in some ways very primary to this. And we can talk about that a little bit later too, because now that we're trying to sort of figure out or construct really what it means to put two women's names or two men's names on somebody's birth certificate as parents, that's a complete fiction, right? That's not who they are genetically, right? They have to have a mother and a father. So we're inventing some of this identity business. And to think then now I have a sexual identity rooted somehow in orientation, again, a much more modern concept, who I am attracted to, which in some ways was never a major question in the past, right? It'd be, well, who is your father and who is your spouse, your husband or your wife? Like, those were sort of the roots of identity, not sort of self-creation in the way that we're talking about it here. So LGBTQ as an identity has surged. It may have peaked, and some aspects of it may be in a downturn, at least in the West, certainly in the United States, a little bit of downturn right now, but mostly in the T's part of this, LGBT. We see, when you talk about gay and lesbian, that's a little bit more fixed to the idea of sexual orientation, which itself is not fundamentally fixed, but is a little bit more robust than we would say bisexuality or calling myself non-binary. That makes, in some ways, no sense. It just means you don't feel feminine or masculine, so you're going to say that you're neither one or the other. A lot of these things are constructed today in a way that they just weren't in the past.
Right. One of the things that I spotted in your article in Public Discourse about the surge in LGBT identity, self-identity, again, we emphasize the word self, meaning we live in the age of civil rights, human rights, as is called in Europe. Therefore, I have the right to identify myself as I please, as I wish. And so those types of identities sort of, I would imagine, fluctuate or very fluid. They evolve maybe from day to day, depending on one side of the bed. Waking up this morning, I identify myself in this category. Tomorrow, I get mad at somebody in this category. I identify myself in a different category, and it's sort of whimsical. But one of the things that really struck me, surprised me in your article, and maybe you can give us some statistical data as well, because it's very interesting, but you emphasize that a lot of these LGBT, I'm dropping Q from the title, a lot of the identity, LGBT identity, does not have anything to do with actual behavior, meaning sexual behavior of a male with another male, a woman with another woman, but it's spreading shockingly, to me, I was shocked, Surprisingly, it's spreading among heterosexual groups,
Yeah. Yeah.
among people that have intimate relationships with people of the same sex. So really, what's going on here?
Yeah. So just to qualify that, that data is from 2021, which in most eras of human history would not be that far back in the past, but we're dealing with things that are sort of changing in front of our eyes. So I'll get to that in a minute. But yeah, 4 years ago, there was some pretty good data analyses that asked people if they, identified with the LGBT community or something like that, which is kind of a weird because that's you would think maybe they hang together, but there's significant differences among them, and increasingly, I think that LGs wouldn't mind if the Ts had their own thing going. But in the General Social Survey, a very good American survey administered every 2 years since 1972, showed back then that the share of LGBT Americans under age 30 had exploded from just under 5% to over 16% in 11 years. Right? 1 percentage point gain per year for 11 years. That's something. That's more than tripling. Okay, and yet, actual sexual experience with someone from the same sex was about half of that figure, right? So you had plenty of people who were identifying as LGBT, but were not in or had not recently experienced some sort of same-sex sexual behavior or relationship. So that makes you wonder, well, what's going on here, right? And a first signal that there is some political aspect to this. It is, and back to the self-identity, it's like, I'm going to choose because I feel like I'm on the outs somehow with the opposite sex, or I feel personally passionate about a particular political issue around the treatment of LGBT persons, again, whatever that means as a monolith, that you might say, oh, I want to identify as such, okay? And frankly, since we have privileged self-identity so much, it became just well, do you call yourself this? Do you identify with this movement? Which meant very little about what we would expect from you next in terms of your relationship behavior. So that was not so much alarming as illuminating, that we are talking here about something that is not like tribe or kinship in the same way, and frankly not like race and ethnicity, but much more flimsy in the sense of not as quite as deeply rooted. And frankly, that's important and good to know that when we evaluate the whole of what a person says about themselves and what they do, that an identity can be like a tacked on addition that is not necessarily central to their conduct and to their relationships. So I think it's one of those things where when we saw it, we thought, what are we dealing with here? This is not, we realized all that talk about things that were fixed, right? In the American legal system, there was so much talk about immutability, right? Well, when you can leap from 5% of the population to 16% of the population in 11 years, we're not talking about immutability anymore, right? We are talking about great mutability and changeability. So it's been interesting being a scholar in this domain and trying to navigate all the half-truths and trends that are being characterized in some ways as stable that are anything but.
Indeed, obviously, I'm not a sociologist, but as a person that's viewing, reading, uh, trying to understand what's going on, what you're actually seeing is bizarre to say the least. One question that just popped to mind is over the last 10, 15 years that when I have actually followed these trends and the studies, one thing that I have noticed is that LGBT identity sort of fades away or diminishes with age. Probably have seen that as well. The number of people who identify as lesbian or gay or whatever sort of goes like goes up to a certain age, then it's stable for a certain number of years in somebody's life, and then it declines with age. What explains that? Again, is it
Yeah.
whimsical
Yeah.
thing, or people come back to their innate sexuality? How
Yeah.
do we explain that?
Yeah. I remember, I forget which book it was. I think it was in Cheap Sex, the third book I wrote, which is sort of on the economics of human relationships. I noted there a graph that showed sort of the leap in non-heterosexual identities among women, starting roughly when they're in their late teen years, and perhaps even a little bit earlier now, but that it peaks in the mid 20s and then begins to decline, such that by age 40, there are fewer self-identified lesbians than self-identified gay men in the United States. So I'd say when you're taking a snapshot at age 25, it looks like there's 3 times as many lesbians as gay men in the United States, but it isn't necessarily true, right? Or it certainly isn't robust. So by the time you hit age 40, then lesbians are rarer than gay men. Now, I would say, though, that the L and the G are more robust self-identities than the B and the T. And the G is more robust than all of them, right? Gay men's homosexual tendencies tend to not fluctuate too widely, right? The advent of talk about malleability in sexual identity and expression started with an evaluation of women's sexuality. And it's widely held today that there is very little immutability in women's sexuality, and that it's far more socially attuned and socially cued than men's sexuality. Men's sexuality tends to be a little bit more robust. There's not a lot of 20-somethings wondering who they're attracted to. By then, those things are largely stable. Not completely so, but largely.
And I have tended to see such studies basically in the UK, which for some reason every year or maybe every other year, the UK government has these huge opinion polls or studies where they talk with, I don't know, 100,000 people, and they ask them about their sexuality. And there, indeed, the curve is really, again, you can see in the people below the age of 20 or 30, you see a significant jump in self-identity as being gay or homosexual, lesbian, whatever. And then after a certain age, it drops significantly. And what I have also found interesting, Dr. Regnerus, is that the question is, how do you identify? The question is not what behavior do you engage in? Because I would imagine that if the question were about behavior, maybe the percentage of people who would identify as LG or whatever would be significantly less, but that's for another conversation. Let's go back to another topic related to the article that you published 3 years ago. You also talk in that article about ideological and political self identity, and you emphasize that what we are or have been witnessing back then is the rise of an ideological and political self identity, particularly in the LGBTQ community. What were you trying to explain by that?
Yeah, insofar as there is a LGBT community, I do think it is starting to fracture in significant ways. Um, the moniker LGBTQ, I don't think it's very helpful to ask people, do you identify with it? But survey companies have done so, and scholars can do so. I just don't think it tells us a great deal about it, as we just discussed, because it doesn't correlate to behavior as well as we would have thought. But when people say, oh, I'm LGBTQ, we just assume they have relationship behavior patterns that are quite distinctive from heterosexuals, which should not be assumed, right? So insofar as the confusion about this is associated, or confusion about this is a understandable reaction to it, we presume somebody is a political conservative and maybe a Christian. Insofar as you see this and this supposed confusion, you think, oh, this is normal, and people are free to do such, and we shouldn't criticize their choices, etc. Then we equate it with a more progressive party identification. So I don't know that it's helpful to just ask the question about identity. Generally speaking, in my research world, certainly in the book Cheap Sex, my primary interest was, what do you say about yourself, right? Not so much that, actually, but what do you do, right? So I've always been interested in studying relationships, which is action-oriented. You enter a relationship, you stay in that relationship for a time or for lifelong, and then we can characterize what that relationship has fruited and your satisfaction within the relationship. But just the identity fixation is only so interesting. And it's good for political sales, I think, but I think normal people don't live in an identity. They live in relationships with other people. In fact, Margaret Archer, who was this British sociologist and had been appointed chair of the Pontifical Committee on Social Sciences until late in her life, she talks about some of these things as serially reinvented man, right? Kind of do-it-yourself biographies, inventing and reinventing ourselves, rooted in no social structure whatsoever. And so Margaret Archer said, this is, an exhausting concern with identity and status, and that it's completely doomed to failure. I mean, to sort of say I identify as LGBTQ is to say I'm rootless and really have no community that's fixed, right? Relationships that are transient. They don't instruct us on how to live, okay? So if I identify myself as Romanian, Orthodox, from this town or this region, all of those things signal not only something on a map, something that we can get our heads around, but they also indicate a real social structure in which people are embedded and people live. Things that give cues about social norms and expectations about how we ought to behave and how we ought to live. So Archer says this new turn towards these, they're not meaningless self-constructs, but they are rootless self-constructs, leaves people vulnerable. She called it chronic ontological insecurity. Chronic insecurity about who am I and where do I belong? Who are my people? What am I supposed to do? Frankly, I think that characterizes our situation well. And it's also fosters some sympathy for people who are stuck in a very transient identity community, if you could call it that.
I agree with you. It definitely triggers my compassion as well when you see people identifying today in one manner, tomorrow in a different manner. And I think that a lot of people in the Christian community have sympathy for people who are, drawn to this lifestyle and so on and so forth, and they fade in and out of this lifestyle. It is indeed a tragedy, and unfortunately, we've got to admit, even in our families, Christian families, we do have, uh, members that identify with the LGBT community, and some of us go through a lot of self search and torment, and we try to understand what's going on, and then in the end, we feel the same degree of compassion and sometimes even despair, and hope for the best, hoping that even members of our family will find a way back to normalcy. Uh, One thing that I have also spotted in your article a couple of years ago was that abortion is somehow connected to the LGBTQ whatever self-identification. That sort of
Yeah.
surprised me. I think that was either your research that you have relied on from different studies. Is that
Yeah.
accurate?
Yeah. There was one particular study we did. It was published in the Archives of Sexual Behavior. My colleague and I had analyzed data from 2018. I just replicated it now in 2025, the data itself. I'm going to take a look and see if it's still the same. And we asked a question that I kind of threw on that 2018 study as a lark, just as a curiosity about whether the American adults thought it was a good idea to, or permissible, I should say, to treat an adolescent who has gender dysphoria, meaning they don't quite know who they are, they feel like they're born in the wrong body, if we should treat them with hormones or surgery as adolescents. And at the time I thought, well, that may not yield much. But then it actually showed that there was almost a quarter of the American public who approved that, who said that's okay. That took me back thinking, well, that was higher than I thought at the time, 2018, 7 years ago. And when we studied it, what predicted that, right? I mean, and the most powerful predictor of that sympathy with treating an adolescent surgically in order to relieve gender dysphoria was whether they identified as pro-choice or pro-life on some spectrum, right? If they identified as strongly pro-choice, they thought this was okay, right? And I'm thinking, now we're talking about abortion. Here we're talking about gender dysphoria and surgeries. What's the connection? And I only started making the connection when there was such pushback after Roe v. Wade fell, that the LGBT community, for lack of a better term, was very worked up about the abortion battle. Like, okay, didn't seem like your issue. But so then you dig into it, and it's like, okay, the strings are attached all over the place. We were surprised, but we shouldn't have been. Opinions about abortion and gender medicine tend to turn on basic differences about how people understand what the human person is, how they understand their own body, other people's bodies, and the very ends for which we exist. Then it took me back to this, when I first got into, even before I went to graduate school, James Davison Hunter, well-known sociologist in the United States, wrote a book called Culture Wars. In fact, he coined the term culture wars, which is pretty interesting. In it, he described this kind of pitched battle between the progressive camp and the orthodox camp. And in the progressive camp, bodily autonomy is paramount. We determine who we are. We should be free to do what we want with our bodies, and the control and the redirection of bodily processes, right? On the other hand, Hunter describes the orthodox worldview, which is very different. We are not our own. We belong, body and soul, to our maker. So our bodies, its systems, its parts, its organs, its processes have a natural purpose, a natural end towards which they are objectively ordered and angled. So life is to be received as a gift. I mean, the two are quite strikingly different orientations. And so then the idea that, a pregnancy can be surprising, shocking, and that you have the right not to be pregnant, right? Just like you have the right to self-identify as you wish, then it is actually a very short leap to think about, I have the right to body modification in service to my self-definition. So in the end, the people spoke. We just looked at the variables, and pro-choice was the best predictor of what you thought a teenager should do surgically about their own body, right? So that's a rather staggering leap to make, but politically it hangs together, right? Now, some people have changed their mind about this. In fact, the piece I wrote just the other day reminded me that some things change. Whereas in 2018, a quarter of the American population said, yes, adolescents should be free to do that surgically. Now we're down to under 20%, right? Usually we're used to things rolling in this domain in a progressive direction. Same-sex marriage continued to roll in a progressive direction. I think it might have peaked in the United States, but it's not at risk of being overturned anytime soon. But here, now we're down to about 18%, 19% of the population endorsing that. So it's rolled back almost, a little over 20% in, what is that, 7 years. So there is
right.
some reason for thinking that a turn has been made here. And, one of the reasons I do some work in Eastern Europe around the marriage issue is to try to get countries and peoples to see that there is a process here, right? It starts with civil unions, which are never enough. It leads to civil union law leads to the expansion for, it becomes the same thing as marriage, but a different word, in which case then the word itself has to follow once people have kind of swallowed and gotten used to this, the idea of the law changing. Then comes marriage. And with it comes gender identity issues in a few years, right? We're talking about in cosmic space and time, not much in terms of duration. It's just, it's striking. So the last several years I've been thinking, if you can just convince people in a country to wait and see for another decade or two, I think there will be buyer's remorse in some of these nations, and they'll have sort of some blowback politically, such that there will be efforts to try to undo and unravel some of these things.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in the context of Romania in a few minutes. You're right about what I call the salami tactics. Initially the demands from the LGBTQ whatever community seem reasonable, compassionate, from the outside. Then after 5, 6, 10 years, people begin to say, well, why not grant some civil rights? And that's not enough. Then you're moving on to another stage, a higher stage, more demands, civil unions, and then litigation, and then adoption of children, and then all sorts of additional perks, and until the difference between civil unions and marriage, traditional natural marriage, simply disappears. Uh,
Yeah.
One of the things that you touched on about 5 minutes ago that I like and I would like to emphasize, I mean, to explore more this topic, but from a Christian point of view, is self autonomy. If I'm not mistaken, back in 2015, when the Supreme Court of the United States actually uh, declared same-sex marriage in the United States a constitutional right, I think that one of the 4 or 5 grounds that they listed for granting that wish to the LGBTQ community was precisely self-autonomy, which was indeed and still is to this day, a very slippery topic, a very slippery concept, which it worries people like me and others that are concerned about where we were once, where we are today, and where we might be tomorrow if this self-autonomy issue keeps on goes on. But one of the things that you did in your article, and I would like for you to explain because it was so refreshing and so encouraging to me as a Christian. And by the way, folks, the gentleman that I've spoken with today, sociologist Dr. Regnerus, is a practicing Christian, a man of great spiritual commitments, has written in this piece, and if not today, then tomorrow I'm going to put on my Facebook page a link to his article that it's a must, you've got to read. And at some point, Dr. Regnerus, if I don't forget, I might ask you if you will please allow me to, or maybe the people that public discourse, whether or not we could translate your article into Romanian and post it on our websites, but we'll talk about that later on. But you make some interesting points about why self-autonomy is not permitted in our Christian tradition. And that was really a powerful and refreshing comment that you made, and I would like for you to explore that with us tonight.
Yeah. We see happiness differences between Republicans and Democrats in the United States. We see them between gay and straight. We see them between married and unmarried. Part of that is rooted in this idea that that I am not here on earth to create myself. Back to Margaret Archer, she says this is an exhausting experience where we're trying to have this, she calls it a reflexive project of self, where more than ever, what becomes of us is up to us today, right? This is why parents in the States can obsess about where their children go to school, where they go to university, what jobs they have, because rooted in those seems to be our self-esteem, right? And then we wonder why between 2018 and 2025, we've seen a statistical leap in the share of people needing counseling, the prescriptions for medication that are for mental health issues and anxieties. It's just not surprising because we forget who we are. It's kind of funny in some ways, but it's deeply saddening and disturbing that you forget that that you don't have to make it up. that who you are is that, you were born uh, already with God, who had his mind upon you from the beginning of creation, right? And you're not born only for time here, but for eternity. I teach a course on Catholic social thought to university students here, a small number, and we revisited this a little bit recently, where we were talking about this idea that we're constantly thinking about, who am I? What should I do? And I'm aging a little bit. Peter, you're aging. I mean, sometimes we can look back at when we felt better, when we had more energy, when we felt like maybe we were had more work time, all this stuff. And I think, maybe God is telling me now, like, remember, I didn't design you to be some sort of 30-year-old at the peak of their whatever. Handsomeness, beauty, athleticism. I created you for eternity. And you're moving towards the end of the early stage of this thing, but you're created for all eternity. And that just kind of comes as a shock, even to Christians, to be reminded of it, right? Because we don't think about it very often. So I think Margaret Archer, being a Christian herself, understood this and sees the kind of serial reinvention of ourself as being a hopeless process, when really where our hope is that we didn't call ourselves into existence. We don't have to reinvent ourselves. We have a name, we have a family, we have a place that we're from, we have a history of a people, a nation perhaps, but also a history as a people of God. So that is part of why people are super anxious today, and why parents fret about children fret about their future, when at some level the most important stuff is already fixed before we ever were.
That's one of the beautiful thoughts that I have borrowed from my Catholic friends and scholars like you. You're happy if you accept your identity given to you by God. You're happy if you live within the uh, sphere, within the parameter of this identity which God gave you at birth, God gave you through your parents, God gave you through your community, God gave it to you through your church, and so on and so forth. And that's a beautiful thought, and that's encouraging as well. Another topic that you raise in your article is the correlation between language and this self-chosen identity. And I think you made the argument that a language cements or tends to cement someone's identity. And maybe you can tell us, in the context of the LGBT community, how terminology, language tends to cement or impact this identity. It's
Yeah.
a big deal. Nowadays
It
you've
is
got
a
to be
huge
very
deal,
careful.
right?
Especially,
Uh,
I'm speaking to you from Brussels, and I can tell you that if you misname somebody or you mispronounce somebody's gender or whatever, you can be in trouble. I haven't had that situation yet come up, but I can tell you that people at the office, left and right, tell me about negative experiences, having made mistakes, and the boss is writing them up, pulling them by the collar, or writing them an email. You've got to conform to this policy, so on and so forth.
yeah.
And so it's a great concern to a lot of us. You know, language as something that, of course, we use every single day, but this language which can also cement someone's identity.
Yeah, yeah. Language has to do with authority structures, and so what you just described is, you know, you can see in it a weakness that there needs to be these authorities behind us, making sure we speak correctly, act correctly. I'm looking at my bookshelf, and first thing I see up there is a Foucault reader. I'm thinking, yep, Foucault has made a comeback, right? Sort of the panopticon he talked
I
about.
apologize. You're talking about the French philosopher, right?
Yes, correct, Michel Foucault.
Okay. Can you tell us
We're back
briefly
to
about
the panopticon, where we are constantly surveilled, and that's at some level it's ridiculous, but I know it's also reality. So language and authority structures are fairly pivotal in the LGBTQ space. Anthony Giddens, another sociologist and writer, leading public intellectual in England, one of the more famous sociologists still alive today. He wrote in 1992, in The Transformation of Intimacy, a pretty good book, very prophetic in some ways. Once there is a new terminology for understanding sexuality, ideas, concepts, and theories in these terms, they seep into social life, and they help to reorder it. And now, what you're describing is evidence of that. And back to James Hunter, different book. He talked about his book called To Change the World, that culture is the power of legitimate naming. Now, we don't have to get into debates about what culture is, but just notice the power of legitimate naming, right? So your colleagues have to be careful of what they say or how they mispronounce something or misspell something, because legitimate naming is at stake, because culture is at stake, right? So now we find ourselves kind of wrestling or bristling with our opponents over basic terminology and basic words, right? And then, at least for a time, I don't know if it's going to continue, but in the United States, we were wrestling with, what is a woman, right? How do we describe? So at some level, you can see this is ridiculous, right? That I can't be a woman just because I call myself a woman. If I can, it's got to be backed up by a very authoritative structure, right? And we bristle against that. One of the nice things about the United States, in particular in the state of Texas, is we don't like to be told what to do, especially on fairly self-obvious matters. So I think this can be a bridge too far. Corporations have realized that they've gone a little bit too far. To segment a little bit into the politics that you had mentioned, we've seen corporations and CEOs kind of dial back their support for LGBTQ stuff because they felt like it was no longer, a winner financially. Now, I was never a fan that they were kind of, whatever makes me money is what I'll do. I think that's a ridiculous orientation. But I am glad to see that had happened. So there's a political aspect to this, partly because there is a linguistic and a authority aspect to all of this kind of language and policing. So yeah, this is why the idea of the EU has never really sat well with this American. I realize why it was formed. They have subsidiarity as a central part of the constitution of the European Union, and yet I don't see much subsidiarity in action anymore from the EU to its member states.
You're absolutely right about that, and it's an issue of concern that's dividing political parties, the political spectrum. It's fragmented concerning this issue. I'm very much a fan of the subsidiarity, except it's not actually put in practice, unfortunately. And the more unfortunate part of this is that you don't really have the mechanism to enforce the subsidiarity that we do have in the United States. And for you folks that are not aware, I'm going to give you a brief detail. Dr. Regnerus talked about in the United States, we have this debate right now, which I think is fading, thank God. What is a woman? Probably those of you in Romania don't know this historical detail. About 3 or 4 years ago, President Biden appointed or nominated somebody to the Supreme Court, a black lady, female. I think her name is Jackson, Katani Jackson Johnson. I don't know the exact name, her last name. And she was asked during the Senate hearings by, I think, one of the Republican senators, what is a woman? What is the definition of the woman? She didn't, I think she said she did not know, or she refused to comment on this issue. Imagine normal people like you and I and everybody else that's watching us tonight or is going to watch from now on. Imagine placing in the highest court of the land somebody that's supposed to take care of the laws of the land and is unable to provide a simple answer to one of the most basic issues in anthropology, in human history. What is a woman? It's pretty bad. What I'd like to do now, Professor, is I'm going to ask Janina, she's our technician for tonight, to put on the screen the cover page of a book recently published along, I'm talking about the language and how language can cement identity, that I came across about a week or 2 weeks ago reading in a publication about the book reviews. Janina, yes. If can you please enlarge the image and put it on the screen so that the professor can read it as well, the title? Can you enlarge the image, please? It's a book published by John McWhorter from Columbia University. To some extent, he claims to be conservative, and he published a book that's right on topic of what you and I were talking about now. It's called Pronoun Trouble, the story of us in 7 little words. How the sexual revolution, primarily the transgender revolution, if you will, has changed language. Is it something that you were sort of talking about?
Yeah. The funny thing that McWhorter's picking up on is potentially dialing back already in the United States. Okay, and this was a little bit more characteristic of universities and corporate America, where you were encouraged to put in your email signature your preferred pronouns. So if I was supposed to do it, I was supposed to be he, him, his, right? Which is kind of, at some level, I never did it. I was going to refuse to do it. It never came to that. And now I see far fewer people doing it, which is somewhat refreshing. So I think we've seen a little bit of a turn here in the United States on this stuff, but it's signaled supposedly like not so much membership in LGBTQ, but signaled kind of a sympathy in some ways with it, right? And frankly, women have always been more sympathetic with the LGBT movement in the United States than men have. And in my experience of watching people put their personal pronouns, students put them on course rolls, things like that, it was always probably at least 3-to-1 women who would do that. And seldom would they put they, them, theirs, although a handful of times they did. It's kind of your first clue that you might have a student who, with a transgender identity. So it is, I thought it would be short-lived. I guess I didn't realize it would be this short-lived. It's still around, but it's receding fairly rapidly. I tell you, something has happened in the last few years that I'd say corresponds with the election of President Trump, but is not caused by that election. I think it corresponds to a more primal disapproval of privileging these sort of self-created identities over, we might say, God-given or more robust relational identities that we long have done.
Great, folks. We are grateful to have with us Professor Regnerus from the University of Texas in Austin, discussing very important topics concerning self-identity, the LGBT community, and we'll talk next about Romania and what seems to be coming down the pipeline in the Romanian parliament in a few seconds. I want to thank again the professor for being with us tonight. And by the way, the University of Texas system is one of the most prestigious universities in the world, one of the top universities in the United States, in the world, and if I'm not mistaken, one of the universities with the highest endowments in the world. So we are really honored to have a top sociologist with us in our conversation, and we appreciate your presence and your comments, Professor. Let's switch gears here for a second and talk about a very important topic which is very relevant for Romania in the current context, legislative context. And first, let's talk about same-sex parenting. Dr. Regnerus is an expert in the issue of same-sex parenting. He has written books on the topic. I recall that about maybe 10 years ago, and maybe you can give us more accurate data in that regard. He published a book, a massive book or a massive study concerning the impact that traditional home settings have on children, and compared those outcomes to the impact which children raised in same-sex households, if you will, the impact of that lifestyle on the children. It was a major study. I know, doctor, that you have been subjected to terrible attacks from some of your peers. I recall even seeing some petitions signed by hundreds, maybe more people, requesting that you be expelled from the University of Texas. But you have stood your ground, and I think that time and subsequent studies have vindicated your position. So, putting this in the Romanian context and what's coming up in the parliamentary debates, what can you tell us? I know the topic is huge, but what can you tell us in a nutshell, if you can compare about I'm talking about your findings, the difference between the outcomes and the emotional well-being and so on and so forth of children raised in a normal, traditional, natural family type, made up of one woman and one man, and children, so-called nuclear family, and children raised in non-traditional same-sex households. Very important topic.
Yeah, my introduction to that started roughly in the year 2010, I'd say, when I began conducting research on this subject, the children of gay and lesbian parents. Conducted, at the time, one of the largest random sample, population-based assessments of adult children, age 18 to 39, reflecting on their experience and then sort of how they were faring today as adults if they had a parent who had been in a same-sex relationship while they were growing up, right? So we're not talking about a study that focused on small children. Some people wanted that, but it's not what I could deliver. And we found in that study that we compared a variety of types, whether you were living with a mother and a stepfather, a single mother, father had passed away, biological mom and dad, having had a experience with a same-sex parent, which wasn't common then, much more common with sort of a woman in a same-sex relationship rather than a man, right? So some of this would be was an earlier generation of this, but wherever we saw it, except in maybe a pair of cases, did we see sort of adequate, decent development emotionally, professionally, etc., compared to kids who grew up with a stable, married mother and father. Now, people could say, oh, I mean, most of the criticism was over, well, of course these children will have some damage from having witnessed their parents break up and then mother form a same-sex relationship, etc. So you should compare people who grew up in households that were broken. And then I pushed back against that, saying, well, shouldn't we start with what seems to be a normal, ideal situation, and then compare deviations from that, right? Which is what I did. And in a considerable majority of outcomes, from emotional outcomes, economic, educational, employment, these sorts of outcomes, those young adults who had grown up with a married mother and father, who are still married, fared better than, on average, than anybody else in any other kind of circumstance, including whether they had a mother or father who has been in a same-sex relationship. Well, there was a kind of I would say, a concerted effort professionally in the United States at the time to make sure that findings like that, study designs like that, we're not going to make it into the public dialogue about same-sex unions, families. And so the publication of my piece in 2012 was incendiary, to say the least. And I was brought up on accusations of scientific misconduct, which were dismissed because they weren't true, and endured years. I mean, still to this day, there are colleagues here, not far from this office, who have zero interest in dialoguing with me on this subject because they think I'm wrong, they think I'm corrupted, etc. I think that impulse is starting to turn. Earlier this year, in 2025, there was a pair of sociologists who did what's called a multiverse analysis, meaning they took sort of high-end, basically high-end computers, AI, etc., and ran my analyses, which were public, posted, everybody can get the data. So they had it all. They compared my analysis of the data with two of my primary two critics, and basically said, yeah, Regnerus, he made some choices I'm not sure we would have made, but on balance, his assessment is far stronger than that of his critics using the same data, right? And they even admitted, we actually believed his critics were right. But the reanalysis of the data in literally 2 million different ways, all the permutations that are possible, revealed that the vast majority of the time, my results were illuminating and accurate. And they accused the other two critics, who were their friends, of privileging simple tests of significance, meaning like, as long as something's significant, then it must be substantially important, and hiding the kind of magnitude of effect, right? That I was sort of open book when I wrote mine. The data was available. I showed people the basic statistics and the statistics and the assessments of model fit. So, I was happy to see this come out 13 years later. Um, but it's not a surprise that the damage was done to me. I think to the discipline. I mean, I think there's trust has been public trust in the social sciences is hardly at an all-time high here in the States. So I'll leave it at that. That's was so people talk about trust the science. Well, depends on who's doing it, how they're doing it, how transparent they're doing it, and whether there's sort of cooperation among the guild to sort of suppress alternate understandings.
Yeah, we certainly got a lot of that. Trust the science, follow the science during the COVID years, and so everybody knows where we ended up. Thank you very much for mentioning that. Indeed, I think I've seen about 2 or 3 months ago an article by I might be mistaken about the name of the professor. I think it was Professor Sullivan who wrote
Owens,
Sullins.
Sullivan's.
Yeah, from the University of Washington University. No, I apologize. Catholic University in DC, right?
Yep, yeah, smart
Wrote
guy.
a piece about exactly about recently, uh, sociologists validating your study from about 10, 15 years ago. Professor Regnerus, you're still standing, and we are happy to have you, and as really a beacon of light in the Christian community, bringing these tremendous studies and details. Essentially, what the professor has said is there is a major difference between children raised in same sex households and children raised in traditional households made up of a mother and a father. The difference sometimes, I've seen the studies, the difference is sometimes like between heaven and earth concerning educational accomplishments, and then all sorts of social dysfunctionalities, including dependence on alcohol and drugs, and a whole bunch of other uh, delinquent behavior. And by the way, I want to remind, especially the younger generation, younger people in the audience that are watching or will be watching this podcast. Personally, I've started on this journey of informing the public and fighting for the family about 20 years ago. And I have seen, just like Professor Regnerus, this this line of aggressiveness against people like me and Professor Regnerus and many, many other pro-family, pro-life individuals around the world being attacked day in and day out by our opponents. But I'm grateful to God that in the last couple of years I have also seen the trends slowly turning. It seems that you're turning the corner, and especially since President Trump has become president of the United States, a lot of this nonsense coming from the sexual revolution is beginning to disappear and dissipate, hopefully for good, if not only for a while. We've got two more topics to cover with you, Professor, and we thank you again for your presence with us online tonight. I want to talk about Romania right now. I was saying earlier in the podcast that Romania is considering probably more seriously than before about legislating civil partnerships. Until now, Romania bans, actually in its laws, bans same-sex marriage and civil unions of either type. But since 2 or 3 years ago, when the European Court of Human Rights issued a ruling commanding and ordering Romania to actually implement same-sex regulations, regulating the relationship between people of the same sex, without actually saying in what regard, there has been pressure from the European Union and Brussels on Romania to adopt legislation permitting same-sex civil unions in Romania. And so I would like for you to address this topic, which is of great importance to us in Romania, the Christian community as well, from a policy point of view. The way I see it, and I have seen it for many years, Dr. Regnerus, is I have seen a correlation. Causality, I don't know. Maybe can talk about it as well. But I have seen at least a correlation the between legislating and implementing same-sex unions, same-sex marriage, and the decline of marriage as a societal, as a social institution in the countries which adopted civil unions and same-sex marriage. So, what advice or what comments would you have? Let's say that somebody from the Romanian Parliament is watching or might watch this podcast. What advice? Imagine that you are in front of the Congress of the United States discussing whether or not the federal government should legislate same-sex unions. What would essentially your argument be? I would imagine against.
Yeah, certainly against. And people would wonder, like, oh, now that same-sex marriage is a reality in the United States, and maybe it's normalized now enough that you wouldn't insist on, the sky didn't fall, right? So I never said the sky would fall. I just said I'm committed to telling the truth about things. Did so with that data set. One of the frustrating things about this topic is that it's coming at a time when the institution of marriage is not as strong as it once was. People are not marrying at the rates that they once did. The share of young adults who will marry in their lifetime is considerably smaller than it was in the recent past. So it's certainly true that Obergefell decision to legislate same-sex marriage for everybody, not even legislation, it was a judicial decision in the United States, came at a time when marriage was not at its zenith in strength. It's different than dealing with the gender stuff. The gender stuff is all over the place. Marriage, we're talking about one thing, right? Easier to legislate for or against than to legislate for or against hundreds of different gender-based things. But it is the first in the order of changes that societies will do, right? First comes sort of the idea of endorsing civil unions, permitting them legally, enshrining them, protecting them, giving them the exact same rights as heterosexual marriage, and then you change the name, then you've got marriage, and then you've got gender, which is sometimes a natural next step. I mean, that's why sort of abortion, gender ideology, same-sex unions, like they're highly correlated. So, but back to marriage, I think one of the reasons I never supported it is because it kind of gives short recognition to the work that the marital union actually does. The union of a man and a woman united in marriage is naturally reproductive. It's not always reproductive, but it's naturally reproductive in a way that is not true of gay and lesbian marriages. They have to go seeking a child. I mean, to us, children happen, right? So in one sense, as I said in print the other day, we didn't get same-sex marriage until we had the certain uptake of a contraceptive mentality, okay? I won't get too deep into that here, but apart from the advent and uptake of contraception, same-sex marriage is actually unthinkable, right? Because now, two men, two women can look more like a man and a woman in marriage who are infertile because everybody is naturally infertile. Well, two of those couples are naturally infertile. One couple is artificially infertile. Okay? And so some of these changes are rooted in older changes. But then we think about, like, how do, as the average mother and father, husband and wife, conduct their marriage? They usually have a few children, not as many as they should today, given population decline, which is hasn't really hit us yet, but we can see it coming, and we're not going to avoid it. So how does an average couple function, right? They are concerned for their biological children. They are more concerned for their biological children than they are for other people's children, right? Especially men care more about their own than about other people's kids. Women have a sort of a little more wide scope of care. So when you see two men acquire a child, that's partly to do with care, but also partly to do with status, typically speaking, and money, right? The richest couples on earth, okay, I'll dial that back. The richest couples in the United States who have children are gay men, right? Because children require money to acquire, and money is actually a very helpful thing for children's growth, spending money on them, spending money on care for them, etc. So the richest people who acquire children are two gay men. Now, but nothing can compare to a mother's love. And somehow it's sad to think that there are men out there who have mothers who would willingly deprive a child of the same. Makes no sense to me. On the other side, you have two women, right, who are sharing motherly duties, right? None of those unions, two women, two men, are reciprocal in nature. Your strengths paired to my weaknesses, my strengths, in conjunction with your weaknesses. It's an exchange relationship. Gary Becker, the Nobel economist, always talked about this exchange relationship between men and women. That is marriage. Totally agree. There's not the same kind of exchange going on in same-sex unions. They're just not. And they're different. Women are more likely to split up because they have higher standards for marriage than men do. But when you have a woman who has high standards for marriage, married to a man who has maybe different kinds of considerations, there's a tension there that works most of the time. Whereas a tension with two women that eventually doesn't work, right? On the other hand, you have two men, naturally unfertile, might seek a child. Very few of them actually do. It's a media scripted narrative that they actually are interested. They're the least likely to have children of any kind of union. And they're the most likely to sort of cheat outside of the relationship. And I articulate in the book Cheap Sex that it's not because they're gay, it's because they're male. Right? Men are much more likely to cheat than women on average, but men who are in a marriage with a woman know that she will not accept that, and that's good. So even though my rejection of alternative partners is my own, it is bolstered by the fact that I know that my wife would be deeply unhappy, right? Whereas gay men tend to cut deals in their relationship because both being men, they realize, oh, I know what he's like. Well, it doesn't have to threaten our relationship. And so you've got these unions that are not monogamous. And it's an open secret now. It's not even a secret. So you've got characteristics of men that are magnified when two men get together and form a union. You have characteristics of women that are magnified when two of them. And then you have the modification that a man and a woman do to each other, right? It's a very different dynamic. So one of the reasons why I think the idea of endorsing same-sex unions or marriages as the same thing and worthy of the same protections is the reason it's ludicrous is because they're not the same in terms of the effort that they must give, in terms of the care that they wind up giving, the diversity of care between a man and a woman. And because the women who are married to a man and have children are more likely to work part-time, at least in the U.S. and in countries in Europe, or not at all, compared to two women and two men, right? So they actually give more of their money and their time to their children than do same-sex couples. And so we're talking about unions that in some ways are giving more, and now we're going to punish them because they give more, because other people want that title, right, of marriage, which is not merited in the kind of union they have entered. So I think it's a deep tragedy. It's not an inequality to recognize marriage as between a man and a woman. It's an inequality to not do it. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Indeed, those of you who are watching, what the professor is trying to convey, at least I understand it this way, is if Romania or other countries will take this leap and legislate civil unions of the same sex or opposite sex, you're opening a Pandora's box, which sooner or later is going to result in adverse social consequences for society. I think that you made a very good argument for, we started in the 60s with the contraceptives. From there, we ended up with cohabitation. Then we ended up with divorce. Then we ended up with kids in the street. Then we ended up with dysfunctional families. So instead of the state adopting policies to strengthen the most important social institution in the history of mankind, which is the family, marriage between a man and a woman, and the natural family, husband, wife, and kids, the state has legislated, the state has accepted lifestyles and alternate social institutions. And by the way, we haven't talked about this, but I think you will agree with me, Dr. Regnerus, that the economic implications of all of these social mutations, if you will, through which society has gone from the beginning of the 60s, contraception, divorce, dissolution of the family, cohabitation, and so on and so forth, the economic impact has been enormous on society. Let's now tackle the last topic that we have for tonight, and that is a tremendous piece that really gave me courage, and it was very refreshing to read this. And we're going to end up on a positive note tonight. You published on the 19th of October. I think that was a Sunday. But anyway, the date of the article is October the 19th, published in the Public Discourse. And it's the title of the article is Why Same-Sex Marriage Movement Failed to Launch a Transgender Revolution. And I'm going to yield the floor to you to explain to us. In a nutshell, the professor is telling us, look, the transgender revolution is sort of sliding, hopefully, away. It's diminishing in intensity, which is great news. It's good news. And I would like for you, Dr. Regnerus, to discuss this topic, and then we'll end. Thank you.
I made reference to it earlier when I said, there's been a change in over 7 years in the United States of the share of Americans that support surgery on adolescents who experience gender dysphoria. So there's a kind of a dialing back. Court cases are rolling in favor of prohibiting adolescents from taking hormones and cross-sex hormones, right? And having surgical removal of their parts to somehow align with their gender of choice. Okay, so in some ways, like, we're following aspects of Europe here, right? I know that Finland, I think it was Sweden, maybe even the Netherlands had dialed back a little bit. England had for sure, about how aggressive they're treating minors and the kind of things that they're letting minors choose to do to their own body. Okay, again, it's with one piece in some ways of this idea of altering our bodies chemically, hormonally, and even and surgically to get rid of that which we don't want about them. Right? It's even sort of at some level associated with Americans' penchant for plastic surgery, breast removal, breast augmentation. But we tend to let adults do what they want to do. Here we're talking about sort of what we permit minors to do who are not yet growing. And so let's, the point being that I saw this coming down the road, and I thought, okay, same-sex marriage will lead to what, right? People thought, well, maybe it'll lead to polyamory or polygamy. I thought, marriage is too weak as an institution now to find people that endorse entering in one of them. You don't have to be in a legal matter to be in a relationship with more than one person. It's a moral matter for sure. But then other survey data sort of started showing that the share of Americans choosing the term non-binary for themselves is an odd thing, right? Saying I'm not male or not female, despite what you may think about how I was born and the parts that I was created with. I'm neither one. So some of those things have scaled back now, a good sign, meaning I think their political capital, the kind of the popularity of them has shrunk some. We'll see if it continues. I don't know. But I thought, okay, after all the resources and time and political capital poured into what became the Obergefell decision for same-sex marriage, these organizations they had to pivot and do something else because, they were sitting on top of a ton of resources. The ACLU, which used to protect freedoms, was sitting on a lot of capital, and so they pivoted towards gender, which was a poor decision, but we had all these cases, and so we fought back more successfully in this domain than we could in marriage. I testified both in marriage, federal district court. I testified about gender transitions in federal district. We lost on marriage, and we're starting to win, and we won the Supreme Court on medicine, right, for states to ban it, medicine for teenagers. So it's a good sign, but it should, in terms of for Romania, I should remind them that these things are a package deal. You get the one, you deal with the other. People can think, oh, we can have one of these and not the same. You pick up the legal equality of same-sex unions, it will never stop there. It can't be understood as a one issue at a time squabble. Countries everywhere have treated it like that, but that's not how it is. This is a move to sort of completely conquer the idea that we are created beings and replace it with the idea of self-creation. I mean, is it any wonder that anxiety is a high level? Suicidality in the United States is higher than it's been, especially among the young. It's a rejection of our nature as created. So I wrote a piece about that in Public Discourse and talked about how same-sex marriage did not yield fully to what it could have, at least for now, about this idea of sort of gender madness. Now, at the same time, it doesn't mean that politics matters and elections matter. And this was far easier to accomplish in the United States, having some more sympathetic Supreme Court justices and a president who nominated lower court judges than it would have been had we had a Democrat in the White House. A lot of us aren't thrilled about every aspect of Donald Trump. Some of us hold our noses at some of it and applaud at other aspects of it. But judges matter, elections matter for sure.
Yeah, politics and the law are very important for the direction of society. And I've got to tell you, Dr. Regnerus, after June of 2015, I was very worried. 10 years ago, I had the impression that the skies would fall upon us, just like you wrote in a public discourse, where now Pandora's box has been opened. Polygamy is going to be legislated, legalized in the United States. Polyamory and a whole bunch of other social ills will be legalized. But thank God that did not happen. And I would like to say and give you credit, and sociologists like you and other pro-family, pro-life fighters around the United States, by the thousands, tens of thousands, maybe more, which for the last 10, 15, 20 years have fought, had stood on the walls of the city with your tool in hand, and that was your intelligence, your skills, your profession as a sociologist, and so on and so forth, fighting for the most precious aspects that God has given us, our identity created in the image of likeness, of God. And folks, there are good news coming from other parts of the world. Dr. Regnerus has mentioned Finland, and I also want to mention, in addition, the UK, which you also mentioned, Dr. Regnerus. The UK has sort of taken a lead in stopping this madness, as you call it, with respect to transgender and kids mutilating their bodies. But also, if I'm not mistaken, this summer or maybe late last year, the Supreme Court of Britain, of the UK, made it very clear that in UK legislation there are only two sexes, only two genders, male and female means the way you're born biologically, male means the way you're born as a male at the time of birth. And recently, if I'm not mistaken, not only the United States, in January, February, President Trump issued an executive order stating that federal law in the United States recognizes only two genders, male and female. Italy has done the same, Argentina has done the same, and I think that even in the Netherlands, believe it or not, folks, in the Netherlands, recently I saw in the news that the Prime Minister is attempting to pass similar legislation in the UK as well. I promise that this will be the last question, but you stimulated my thinking, Dr. Regnerus, and I've got one final question, I promise, and that has something to do with scientific research in the United States. I know that the Biden administration has channeled a lot of funds into this dystopian, I apologize, research into gender and the most disturbing nuances and aspects of the gender ideology. But I think President Trump, if I'm not mistaken, and I would like for you to give us an update on this issue, because Mr. Trump has a lot of sympathizers, a lot of fans in Romania. I think that Mr. Trump has scaled back on allocating funds, public funds, federal funds for these types of studies. Am I right about that or wrong about that? What can you give us? We read in Europe that Trump is killing science by, aborting financing for studies and science and so on and so forth. What's really the reality in your area nowadays in in light of the political changes in the United States?
Yeah, it's a little complicated. It's a little bit unclear, but one thing is true is in this administration, finally, we've seen some attempt to reform the federal grant system, of which social scientists, as well as others, especially natural scientists, medical, this is where a lot of the most prestigious grants and some of the largest grants are made. I myself got one, oh man, 15 years ago, no, 20 years ago, I'd say, from the National Institutes of Health. But the National Institutes of Health, for the longest time, has underwrote research on SOGI topics, sexual orientation and gender identity, to the tune of at least 8 figures per year. I mean, we're talking about potentially grants of up to $250 million per year from the National Institutes of Health, different divisions on SOGI questions. And lots of the research I read has come from federally funded stuff, right? So in some ways, the people have paid for the research mechanisms of social change here, right? Whether they wanted to or not. Now, I don't want to blame Biden too much for that, because every single administration prior to this time didn't do anything about it. One of the frustrations I had back in Trump's first term in office is this very thing. And it seemed that he didn't quite get it, and there was an obstruction between the knowledge of it and the political willingness to do something about it. And so it didn't happen at all, right? So I was pleasantly surprised that he has problematized federal grant giving. Now, lots of good research is among that, along with the stuff that I'm not crazy about at all. So it's difficult to sort this with a fine-tooth comb. But I do think the federal grant system has been responsible for research that has made same-sex marriage possible, thinkable, and a reality. And it certainly has as well for the same thing with gender medicine on adolescents and young adults. So that's to problematize it, I think, has been helpful. We'll see what happens, how robust that challenge is.
That's a problem in Europe as well. I just learned a couple of weeks ago that the European Union has allocated close to €1 million to the LGBT community in Romania to promote, to essentially engage in PR campaigns and propaganda and lobby the Romanian parliament to embrace civil unions and so on and so forth. Okay, well, we thank you very much, Dr. Regnerus. We wish you a good day, a great weekend, and I'm closing by saying we are inviting you to Romania. I know that I have done it by email, but now officially online on this platform, we are saying we are inviting you to Romania, to come to Romania, and we'll talk about details when that might be possible. We also want you in Brussels to come here and speak in different venues, but that's a little more complicated. But that is our hope, our wish, that people like you would have a voice in the highest venues, political, legal, academic venues in Europe and Romania as well. Thank you again, and we wish you a great weekend and a great afternoon.
Thanks.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Peter. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.